Hello. So, yes, as you've just heard, I'm a computer scientist and not an artist, not a philosopher. So I'll be approaching, this talk will come from kind of a different angle, perhaps, from the other ones we've heard today. And in some sense, I'm gonna try to look at almost like an opposite perspective. So I think what you'll hear quite a lot about today is how artists can use AI, can use neural networks and these technologies in a creative way. And what I'm going to talk about is how the internal processes that are going on in these models that generate images and sounds and things like that, how those processes in some way resemble human creative processes. So the talk's called Madness in the Machine, Generative Models in the Context of Human Creativity. And I should stress these views or these kind of this description of artificial intelligence and of these kinds of algorithms and networks isn't necessarily the one that most people in the field, for example, of deep learning would reference. This is more just, it's kind of my way of thinking about how these algorithms operate, and I'm just kind of hoping that maybe it will help to give you all a peek under the bonnet and what's going on sort of under the hood with these algorithms. Okay, so I think one really fundamental thing is this idea of this kind of interplay or contrast between structure and noise, or you could call it order and chaos, madness and reason, things that are fabricated versus things that are found. You know, this feels like all of creativity somehow involves this dichotomy. This is why I've called it madness in the machine. And so we have these two quotes here from famous writers. The most beautiful things are those that madness prompts and reason writes. And then we have, you know, this quote from Hemingway: the good parts of a book may be only something a writer is lucky enough to overhear, or it may be the wreck of his whole damn life. And I think what they're both getting at is that there's something kind of arbitrary about the source of inspiration. There's this idea that something comes along that really wasn't under the artist's control, it wasn't reasoned or planned by them, but is then transformed into art by the internal processes of the artist. And I think there's definitely a parallel here with the way we attempt to generate things using algorithms. So yes, the idea is that the inspiration is random, but the outcome is, so I use this word a lot, structured. I don't know if that's kind of a familiar word here. It sort of means that there's a pattern, there's a shape going on here that isn't just something that would occur randomly. Okay, so it's all very well to talk like that, but you know, what does that actually mean in practice? So you know, underlying most of these AI techniques, these generative models, what you really have is good old-fashioned statistical models. So you have machine learning algorithms. What do? They find structure by, more or less, by fitting probability distributions to data. And so we have here an example of a very simple probability distribution. I probably just took this off Wikipedia. It's a two-dimensional Gaussian distribution. And by the way, I should say this talk is going to be very non-technical. There may be one or two equations or graphs like this in it, but it's absolutely not important to worry about the details here. This is just a sort of illustrative example of what a simple probability distribution looks like. Okay, so given that distribution, which is basically these kind of contour lines that appear on the graph, you can then start generating things. You can generate data by picking random points on that graph. That doesn't sound very creative so far, right? All we've got is a little dot appearing at some XY position. So how do we get from that to something that resembles a creative process? Well, one of the key ideas to get around is that when you're creating anything real, anything interesting, you're working in what we tend to refer to in sort of machine learning as a high-dimensional space of data. What does that mean? So, you know, when we talk about, so it's actually, in some ways, it's kind of misleading. It just comes back to our kind of human tendency to want to reason about things in kind of geometric space, to talk about 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. Once you go beyond 3 dimensions, calling it a space is you know, kind of a, it's just a metaphor, it's an analogy. So anyway, what do I mean by high-dimensional space? So, you know, there's this famous story, the Library of Babel. I'm sure a lot of you have read this, where Borges imagined this idea of a library that held all possible books. So he says, shells register all the possible combinations of the 20-odd orthographical symbols, a number which, though vast, is not infinite. So that's important. There's not an infinite number of possible books, but it's just ridiculously large. And so, my sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation here, if we allow up to 10 million letters, essentially, or 10 million characters per book, and there's 25 possible characters, then you have this number that is, impossibly larger than the number of particles in the universe. So to actually build this library is kind of, it's clearly unthinkable. Another example here, this famous Michelangelo quote, every block of stone has a statue inside it, and the sculpture is the task of the sculpture to discover it. So he's taking this big block of Italian marble and finding all of these things inside it. And so again, if you imagine somehow parameterizing the space of possible statues that you could get from a block, lots of ways you could do that. You could think about it in terms of voxels or something, or you could think about the actual chiseling strokes taken by the sculptor. Obviously, there would be a lot of parameters. It would be a very high dimensional space. These are things that, unlike the example here where we can just plot the whole space on a piece of paper because it's two-dimensional, we can't do that with any kind of realistic data. We can't even enumerate them. We can't count. We can't write down all of the different possible options that we have. So what do we have instead? Well, ultimately what algorithms have actually is the same thing that people have, which is a generative process. So the simplest example of a generative process in artificial intelligence, I think, is an autoregressive model. And so the kinds of autoregressive models I'm talking about, these recent ones, are generally, they're generally neural networks. They're parameterized by neural networks. That point in some sense isn't so important. But the basic concept is that if you've got this very high dimensional data, so you've got this whole book full of possible words, what you can do is you can split that data up into a sequence of very small pieces. So you look at each word individually, each letter, each pixel, each voxel, and then you predict each piece conditioned on the previous one. So very simple example, if you have a language model that is modeling one word at a time, the probability of the sentence, the sky is blue, can be split up into this, what we call the prior probability of then the probability of sky given the probability of is given the sky, and so on. And then once you have these probabilities, you can start generating data by guessing what will come next, one step at a time. So if you've got this distribution of all the possibilities, you can pick a sample from that. You can choose something, maybe after the word the sky, the word is quite likely. There's a few other words that could also, you could also think of the sky over, the sky above, something like that. All of these will be given a different probability, and you're going to pick something according to that probability. And then once you've picked it, you kind of treat the guess as if it's a real thing. You feed it back into the system, and then you guess what comes next. And this is so why I think that generating autoregressively is a little bit like hallucinating or dreaming. It has this flavor of there's something that you just made up, and then having made it up, you're going to treat it as if it's real, and your brain is going to deal with it as if it's something that actually happened. And so what is this? This is a very nice illustration of an autoregressive model that I found on the internet. This is by someone called Dan Catt, who kindly gave me permission to use this. And what it illustrates is that underneath these kinds of autoregressive models, there's basically a tree of possibilities. So what he's done here is trained actually quite a simple language model. So this is not a sort of state-of-the-art powerful neural network language model. It's a simple, I think, trigram language model, which means every word just depends on the 3 words before it. Or is it the 2 words before it? Something like that, anyway. So, and it was generated by taking a novel by Jeff Noon, Channel Skin, I think it's called, or Channel 1 Skin, I thought it was. Anyway, trained on that novel, he gets a set of sort of probabilities, an autoregressive model that kind of has a certain degree of, a certain belief about which words will follow which. So rather like the example we saw before with the generated poem, what this does is reveal the kinds of patterns that there are in the text that it's trained on. Anyway, he then generated this sentence, the whole forest had been anesthetized, and so on. I think maybe the first few words were provided by the author, and then it was allowed to generate. And what this image illustrates is all of the other branches, all of the other possibilities that could have been made when that sentence was generated. So you can see there's these certain points where there's different choices the model could have made. At the point when it said anesthetized, it could have said recorded, issued, set up, lots of other things, all of which would have been, at least in this kind of this world, somewhat consistent with the start of the sentence. Her temporals could have glowed instead of her temples wired, and so forth. And essentially, any one of these branches could have been followed to generate some other piece of text. And I just find this helpful to keep in mind when thinking about these types of models, that there's always this tree underneath them. And so, if we go back to this idea of auto-suggesting text, if you're using, for example, your Gmail app, and you see that having typed part of a sentence, it suggests a continuation for that sentence. What that's basically doing is taking a tree, a much more richer and more kind of complex tree than this one, and picking out branches that it thinks are particularly high probability, things that are really likely for you to actually type. Of course, it could show you far more. It could give you, it could completely overwhelm you with choices, but then, it would get in the way, basically. That basic model, which is very simple, has now been taken quite far. So I don't know how many of you have seen this unicorn story that's become quite a sort of a poster child for generative models. This is from earlier this year from a group at OpenAI. They trained a very large, very powerful neural network on a huge amount of data, and then basically followed the procedure I just said. So they gave it, in this case, they gave it a paragraph, the part that says, in a shocking finding, down to the unicorn spoke perfect English, and then they allowed it to free generate conditioned on that paragraph. So it's essentially asking the network to say, okay, if this is how this article starts, how should it continue? And it continues with this, remarkably sort of consistent description of how the scientists named this population. They're Ovid's unicorn. He's from the University of La Paz, which fits with the fact that it's in the Andes Mountains. And it kind of, what's sort of, it's a little bit hard to get across the flavor of why this is interesting. So it's very easy to look at a generated image and say, okay, that looks like a real image, that's amazing. Generating text doesn't seem like such a difficult thing. Like a person can sit down and write a whole bunch of text very quickly in a way that we can't generate a photorealistic image very quickly. But actually, text in some ways is harder for these algorithms, because in order to write something like this, it needs to remain kind of contextually consistent. It has to keep around the fact that it's talking about unicorns in the Andes Mountains, that they spoke English. And importantly, this is something that it had never read before, right? There were no articles in the training set about unicorns in the Andes Mountains. So it has to, given some new piece of information, has to kind of assimilate it and stay sort of relatively consistent with it. And another thing that I think that's interesting is, when we look at these generative models, the mistakes they make are super interesting, because the mistakes reveal something about what the network's kind of world model is, what it's learned. So there's some odd things here. One of them is that the unicorns are four-horned. And so, the one thing, the sort of defining property of a unicorn is that it has one horn. Even the name, it's got uni in it. So there's something like, that feels like a mistake that a person just wouldn't make, in that a person would just sort of, automatically have kind of visualized these things containing a single horn. Okay, so rewinding a little bit here to some work that I did, and this is by deep learning standards, this is basically a prehistoric paper. This is from 6 years ago. And the point here was just to show that this same method of autoregressive prediction can be used with continuous data. So it's not just about predicting one word after another. It can be used for things that, when I say continuous, things like for images and sounds and things that don't consist of a set of discrete words. And so in this case, this was for online handwriting. And the data was recorded as a set of pen coordinates as a person moved there, as a person wrote on a whiteboard. And what this image shows is the set of predictions made by the network. So after each blob in this image, the next blob is the network's prediction for where it thinks it will go next. And the heat map shows, where the red parts are where it thinks it's most likely that the pen will be next, and so forth, further out. And it shows that there's a very, just by following this simple protocol of basically whatever I've given you, try to predict what comes next. It shows that the network learns a lot of rich structure. It's amazing just how much you can learn simply by predicting data. And yes, again, you can think about this as a branching tree. So this illustration shows, okay, given a particular series of pen strokes, which is this kind of nonsensical stream of letters, you can look at possible continuations, the branching points, the place where the tree could have grown elsewhere, according to this predictive model. You can also, of course, and the original sort of motivation for this work was that you can also, what we call, condition or control the predictions made by the system by feeding it some real text. So this is a text synthesis, handwriting synthesis, program, essentially. So the idea is that, given some text from his travels, it might have been, the network then actually produces these images. And there's an online demo. I think I haven't put the URL on here. It still works after 6 years. It's taken some work to keep it going on one of the University of Toronto servers. Anyway, this idea of conditioning is important because this comes back to the notion of how do artists use these systems as tools. So basically, as long as they receive some input, in this case the text, then you have some control over what they do next. In the case of the text itself, the input is sort of like a prefix. It's a start to the story, and then you let it continue. But of course, there's so many other ways we could think about controlling these systems and having more, more ability to modulate what they do. But I think that will be covered a lot more in the other talks today. One thing we can also say is that, if you take away that conditioning signal and just allow it to free generate, you get this kind of nonsense. But within this nonsense, you see little islands of kind of structure. So you see like the word the or the word he appearing in there. And what that shows is that even just at this low level of prediction, the network has learned some of the high level structure in the system, which is something that is remarkably difficult to do. Okay, I'm going to skip through the next few slides because I think I'm already...
It's never been in their songs.
Oh, tell you what, I'll go back. It's too much fun. So a bunch of you may have heard of WaveNet. That basically took the same principle and applied it directly to, raw audio data. Now, if I can get this to play.
The first commercial flights took place between the United States and Canada in 1919.
So this is now used in production by Google. Often if your phone is speaking to you, then it's running technology like this under the hood. And of course, that means that people designing these technologies can, they can choose what your system says to you. To some extent, they can modulate how it says them and then get it, transferred into speech. And obviously, there's lots of creative things you can do there. Because it's a raw waveform, you can also apply this to music, for example. So. That's from a network trained on a whole bunch of classical piano music. And you can also run this thing, again, take away...
It's never been in their songs on a design. Opens in Delmart and Anson. Brevwayan in Presidents 1-1 by Ronomus. Bats Desenich by Hearing Tild Tub.
So once again, you hear something that, it's gibberish, but you can hear little islands of words in there. And so this is what happens. Maybe the key point to take away from this is just how important that conditioning signal is. That's the thing that provides the kind of the high level structure for these models. And then they sort of fill in the gaps is basically how they work. Okay, so one thing you might ask is, how would you do this with images, right? It's all very well with a sequence of words or a sequence of audio samples. Images aren't sequences. Well, what you do is you just turn them into sequences and you predict all the pixels in a particular order, one after another. So going through this image here that's being generated, at each point in time, it's predicting each one of these pixels and using the kind of all of the previous ones that have already been predicted as context. This bar on the right shows basically the prediction distribution. Like it shows what the network thinks will come next in terms of, this is for a particular color channel within the image. It's just a number between 0 and 255. And what's sort of interesting about it is, sometimes it makes these predictions where it's what we call multimodal. There's a strong probability that the next thing will be 0. There's some probability that it will be 255. So a probability of a complete absence of a particular color, or a probability of it very strongly being there. And that's important because that's the branching point. These are the decision points. So it's back to the tree again. The points when it has these two very distinct decisions are the points when two different images or two different pieces of images kind of branch off from one another, and it has the possibility to create different, a diversity of things. Okay, so again, we saw before about how quickly GANs have advanced. The same thing is true with autoregressive models. So this is from 2016. This is what they looked like trained on ImageNet. This is what you got on ImageNet in 2018. And this is what you now get in 2019. So it's basically reached the point of photorealism in a few years. And I should credit, these are all works by my colleagues at DeepMind. One name you might see on a lot of these slides is Aaron van den Oord, who's really been pushing the envelope as far as these autoregressive models go. If you're still not convinced, it does faces as well. I think it's safe to say that these are now indistinguishable from real images. And one of the key things that makes this most recent model so powerful is that it's got a kind of hierarchical structure. So it does this next step, this tree autoregressive modeling. It does that at several different levels in the system, and that's important again because that way you can kind of create the high level structure first and then fill in the lower level details afterwards. And these details, they turn out to be very important as far as the actual sort of end product of these models go. So you can think of them, I mean, maybe I'm stretching things a little bit here, but you could think of this as something like the creative process of the model, is the thing that the person, when you're designing these models, that's the thing that you're kind of creating, right? So there's no, mathematically speaking, it's hard to argue whether it would be better to do it like this, hierarchically, or whether it would be better just to predict one pixel at a time as was being done before. But intuitively, we have this idea that, well, if I was going to create a complicated picture like that, I'd want a sort of high-level structure first, and then I'd want to go down and put in the details. And that's how, this is, I think, that's a sort of illustrative example of how it is that, in some sense, human-like creative processes end up in these algorithms, because the people designing the algorithms appeal to their own kind of human intuitions when they're making these sorts of decisions about how they should work. And another interesting point about that particular model is that it's relatively diverse in what it generates. So this is the ostriches from trained on the ImageNet ostrich class. Real images are on the right, and you can see they're very diverse. Some of them are close-ups of ostriches' faces. Others are, an ostrich behind a metal fence, 2 ostriches or 3 together or whatever. And if we look at the generated ones, it's not quite as broad or as diverse as that, but it is still there's a lot of variation there. I don't know if you can see, there's also 1 ostrich with 2 heads. So again, this is back to this, it's interesting the kinds of glitches that these systems make. So you think that it has a pretty consistent model of this bird and that it's generating all these images, but then it can make something with 2 heads. And this is sort of an ongoing area of research, is trying to understand what the actual world models, what the actual representations that these are that underlie these systems. What have they actually learned about the world? They've clearly learned something, or they wouldn't be able to give us back things that look real. But anyway, the point from this issue of image diversity is that they're really trying to kind of learn something not just about a particular image of an ostrich, but really this whole set of images, which when you think about it is an extremely difficult thing to do. I mean, there's this infinite number of possible images for all of these types of animal, types of building, and so forth. And some other models. This is a GAN model. I'll talk about GANs a little bit more later, I think, but it tends to be a little bit less diverse, and so it kind of comes back to the idea that the goal of the GAN is just to create something that looks very convincing, as opposed to actually attempting to model a complete distribution. And I mean, this can be, people have added specific things to address that. But I find that there's an interesting parallel there, again, with human artists, in the sense that it's not necessary. So a writer doesn't have to be able to create any sort of character. It's sufficient for them to be able to create certain types of characters. There's always a sort of a bias that every artist has towards the particular things that they seek to represent. And I think it's an interesting thought that, you know, unlike the sort of traditional statistical machine learning approach, an artist is not attempting to kind of ingest everything and reflect everything exactly as it is. It's fine for them to focus on one, in fact, it's sort of necessary for them to focus on one's particular thing in very vague, kind of high-level terms there. So, you know, what does this mean? You know, if we talk about autoregressive generation as being just this series of things that are somehow dreamed or imagined one after another, I feel like there's a sort of, you know, a direct parallel there with you know, what you can think of as something like autoregressive art. So I think about Picasso drawing, you know, his horses or whatever with a single pencil line. Jack Kerouac typing out on the road in a few days on a continuous scroll. There's this quote by Allen Ginsberg, first thought, best thought. This idea of spontaneity being important in the creative process. There's this idea of surprising yourself somehow because, and it's again back to this notion of the mixture of structure and noise. And actually there's a story that some of you might have heard about this Picasso, or one of these Picasso doodles. It's probably apocryphal, but I think it's quite interesting. Supposedly he was asked to draw a sketch on a napkin in a restaurant, and he quickly drew something like that and then handed it to the woman who'd asked him and told her that will be, you know, 10,000 francs or something like that. And she said, oh, but it only took you, you know, 5 seconds. That's crazy. And he said, no, it took me my whole life. And obviously what he meant was his whole life had been spent training himself to be able to do this. And this is kind of, again, the process that we see in these types of models. It takes a huge amount of time, a huge amount of data to train these models. This is where the GPUs and the TPUs and all the powerful computational hardware comes in. There's a massive amount of number crunching involved in learning all of this structure. But then once you have it and you've embedded it in the system, at least if you're willing to kind of operate in this very kind of this autoregressive forward way, then it's very efficient. You can generate things very rapidly. Okay, so really though, you know, most novels aren't written like that. They're not written like on the road. It's rather this, you know, slow, painful process of, you know, planning, sketching, writing, editing. It's very iterative. There's like one little thing changed at a time, and then you move on. There's this great quote from John Berger that I like here. He says, he's talking about his own writing process. He says, I modify the lines, change a word or two, and submit them again. Another confabulation begins. So there's this idea that the words are talking among one another. Every time you add a new word in, that changes the discussion, and you have to talk for quite a while longer before you can sort of you can decide on what that word should be. And there's a perhaps somewhat tenuous way that you could see this type of process reflected in generative models as well. This happens when those models are not autoregressive. It's not just a forward chain of probabilities, but rather you have mutual interdependencies between many variables. So X depends on Y and Y depends on X. In that case, generating those things together is not so simple. You can't just pick one and then get the other because they both influence one another back and forth. So you end up with something that's more like a sort of a network of things that constantly interacts with one another. So the Boltzmann machine is one of the sort of, I guess, one of the canonical examples of that type of model. Here's another one. This is from 2015. This was a model called DRAW that, again, was worked on by my colleagues at DeepMind. And it's a very interesting one in that it's sort of, the way it works internally, it builds up what we call the canvas inside the network by iteratively, so the movement of these pink boxes shows how the attention of the system shifts around while it's creating these images. Obviously, these are faces up here, and these are from Street View house numbers on the right. And the process of kind of finishing these things is iterative here. Like maybe it stays in one part of the region and kind of crystallizes that and then moves to another region of the image afterwards. So there's something, if you think about it as a creative process, it's a little bit more holistic. It's a little bit more like take this, this sketch or this blurry kind of idea and gradually kind of make it manifest into something concrete. Another model, a more recent model that's kind of works on this principle is what's called flow-based models. And the idea here, so apologies for the maths here, but it's really, you know, if you just look at this little curve on the left, the idea is to take something very simple, a simple, you know, in this case, a white noise, you know, standard Gaussian, and then iteratively transform it until you end up with something complicated. And so I think the key thing here is it's not autoregressive. It's not the idea of actually outputting one pixel at a time or one concrete thing at a time, but it is still iterative. So there's still this notion that you can't somehow, you know, if someone asks you to create an image, it's hard to sort of create the complete thing in one go. It's rather, it's a process. It's a series of steps. Here are some faces created with a flow model. Interestingly here, you can see, you know, these faces are realistic, but they're noticeably more synthetic looking than some of the other ones, the ones I showed before, some of the other ones we'll have seen. They're kind of, it's trained on celebrities, so their faces are sort of probably you know, improbably perfect to start with, but these look too perfect. They look airbrushed, they look symmetrical. And that's actually like a sort of a common failure mode in some sense of AI, of generative models, is that they have a tendency to take the mean. They have a tendency to average things out. And getting away from that and creating things with, I think, what someone once referred to as digital dirt. I think that's been a really sort of key part of when artists started to get really interested in generative models, when they started to create things that looked kind of messed up and interesting as opposed to things that looked sort of too perfect. I'll go through this, you know, talk about GANs. So we already mentioned GANs. Probably you've heard about it a lot. In some ways, what I think is interesting about GANs is, you know, what we've talked about so far. If we think about, again, think back to, you know, how these things reflect human processes. The models we've seen so far are kind of like the positive mode of creativity. They just generate stuff. But we know that when we are making things ourselves, there's a critic there. There's a self-conscious critical phase where we look at what we've done and we decide if it's good and we modify it accordingly and so forth. And in some ways, the GAN bakes that notion into its structure. So it has two networks, a generator and a discriminator. The generator is trying to make data that will fool the discriminator into thinking it's real, and the discriminator is trying to do the opposite, trying to distinguish it from realities. You can think of it as a sort of battle between a forger and a detective, or maybe a little more broadly, an artist and a critic. I mean, that's a little bit unfair. An artist isn't attempting to convince a critic that something is real. But anyway, there's this basic opposition between the two things, and that's proved incredibly fruitful. So these were the sort of the images, I think, that first caught everyone's attention in terms of photorealism coming from neural networks. And it's funny to think that was only, you know, 2 years ago, right? It seems like a long time to me, at least. But this is, you know, it's still, it just shows how powerful is this idea of explicitly having a model that is attempting to kind of to refine and to criticize the thing that the system is doing. Anyhow, what I often think of, here's if I've got time to play this clip here. So this is from the movie Solaris by Andrei Tarkovsky in the 70s. And very briefly, the plot is that a bunch of scientists are orbiting the planet Solaris and finding that it's creating things out of their memories. It's sort of like a big generative model. And at the very end of the film, the hero finds himself back in what appears to be his childhood home with his father. He's looking through the window of it, but there's something not quite right with the scene, right? It's raining on the inside of the house, and the rain appears to be hot or something. He's steaming as it hits him. So there's something, it's regenerated a reality that looks very convincing, but it's not quite right. And sometimes I think of this when I think about the mistakes made by generative models, where as they get more and more powerful, the mistakes get more and more high level and more interesting, and they reveal more semantic information about what it is that they've understood and what it is that they haven't understood. So, and so from there, I'm just going to skip past. So these, you know, I had some slides about possible sort of now outmoded slides about artistic tools based on GANs, but I think you're going to hear so much more interesting stuff about that. I think maybe one last important point I'd like to make is, I've talked about these models so far as if they're as being somehow creative in the human sense, but all they are trying to do is to make things that look or sound real, right? It's just verisimilitude. It's just give me an image that I can't tell isn't a real image. But that's not what we expect. We expect a lot more than that from human creativity. So this is some canonical, and I apologize for my lack of diversity in my choice of artists here. I'm lazily reaching for canonical examples, and of course these tend to be dead white European males. Lots of other people you could put on here, but the idea was just, this is non-figurative art. This is, 20th century. Obviously we moved away from slavishly recreating reality a long time ago in terms of art. This Malevich had this quote, trying desperately to free art from the dead weight of the real world. So is that, an active reaction against this idea of just recreating things. And so, the question becomes, or one question, obviously one answer to that is, well, that's fine. The machines are tools that create things and we'll just use those tools. But one question you could ask is, could the machines themselves actually be creative? And how would you do that, right? If you can't have the objective functions we've had so far because those are just try to model reality, try to predict things correctly. We'd have to have systems that could actually surprise us for us to consider them creative. So how could we train them to do that? Well, one kind of theory of thought here, and this is not specifically about creativity, it also relates to the idea of exploration and curiosity, is to try to make systems that are what we call intrinsically motivated. So they're driven to learn for the sake of learning, rather than being extrinsically motivated by targets or rewards that we've provided them. So as long as we've specified what the targets are, as long as we've said you'll get rewarded for this and not for that, it seems pretty hard for the system to really be creative, for it really to be open-ended and to really surprise us. So it's more like an idea of, can we embody the notion of art for art's sake? Okay, apologize for the equation here, but it is an extremely fundamental equation. This is from Shannon's paper of 1948. That's kind of like the thing that underpins the whole of the information age in some sense. And the idea is that the length of a message is related to the log probability of that message. In very simple terms, this means that when all of these algorithms, as I said at the start, they're fitting probability distributions, one way you can think about that is that they're learning how to compress data. They're building a model that somehow shrinks the world to something more compact. And there's lots of kind of formalizations of this idea. People talk about the Kolmogorov complexity, the minimum message length, minimum description length. It has the same flavor that basically the more you can learn about the system, the more compact your description of it becomes. But what happens then if you want to generate? You want to use this in some sort of creative way. So what happens if you're able to create new data, or even just choose where to look, choose where to point your camera? Then suddenly this idea of compressing doesn't make much sense, right? If your goal is just to compress things and to learn them well, then you should create nothing at all, or you should just go and sit in a corner and stare at the wall so that you never get any more information, but the information you have is very compressible. And so my PhD supervisor, Jürgen Schmidt-Huber, has this theory about how to kind of resolve this paradox, which is that you're not learning how to compress everything. Rather, you're looking for things that maximize what he calls compression progress. So seek out data that maximizes the decrease in bits of everything you have ever observed, and perhaps everything you and the culture that you're in has ever observed. So create the thing that makes the most sense of the world. And if sense is being measured as your ability to now further compress it, right? In the sense that you now have a better model and therefore a more compact model. And one of his sort of bumper sticker, slogans for this is happiness is the first derivative of life. So there's this idea that what makes you happy is this change. It's not the absolute point of how well you've modeled things, but rather the rate at which it's changing, the rate at which it's decreasing. And I think, this is as far as creativity goes, I think it's fair to say that this is more or less unexplored territory. Jürgen these ideas have been around for quite a while, But obviously, it's much harder to put this sort of thing into practice than it is to explicitly train to generate a convincing audio signal or something like that. And I guess the other interesting question we would ask here, and this sort of goes back to some of the things Georgia was saying, is if we did allow them to freely create stuff, well, for one thing, what would we then be doing? What would our role in the creative process actually be, right? There has to be some way in which we're guiding it, otherwise we're just spectators to it. And the other thing that I think is interesting to think about is, would we even recognize their creativity as our own? So even if they were able to do this, the machines, and able to kind of create things that help them to make more sense of their world as they've experienced it, would it be just fundamentally alien to us or not? And I think it's a very interesting question as to whether if you left them to sort of create things in this very open loop way, you would start to actually, there would be some common ground between that and what human artists create. And I think I'm going to wrap up there because I'm running short of time. So thank you very much.